Thank you.
I have great pleasure in announcing the next session. Nusrat Khawaja is going to be moderating this. Nusrat Khawaja is a freelance writer with a focus on art and literature. The session is on Reza Pirbhai's book, FATIMA JINNAH. It's the first academic book on FATIMA JINNAH ever written. And Nusrat Khawaja is going to be in conversation with Reza Pirbhai. She's a freelance writer with a focus on art and literature. She has been a regular contributor to Newsline magazine. Nusrat is also a qualified horticulturalist and landscaper from the Royal Horticultural Society, UK. She holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology from Mount Holyoke College. Since they're on their way up, I'll introduce Reza. Mr. Reza Pirbhai is Associate Professor of History, specializing in South Asia. He earned a doctorate in history from the University of Toronto in Canada in 2004. Before joining the faculty at Georgetown, he was assistant professor at the University of Manitoba, Canada. Nusrat, I'll let you take over. Yahan aa jaiye.
So welcome to Karachi, Reza, to Fatma's city, one of the 3 cities in the subcontinent that she spent time in, including Calcutta and Bombay. She is a national icon, which is not to say that that's a very good place to be, because when you become a national icon, sometimes it freezes you. And it also reduces you in some way to a hagiographical status. So I'm so glad that in your book, you've tried to put flesh back on the bones and put her in the context of Muslim nationalism and the women's movements in the Indian subcontinent. So I think we can start a little bit by talking about how she started off as the youngest sibling of Jinnahs in an Ismaili Hoja family in Karachi, and then Jinnah became her guardian and then launched her into a very different world from the world that her parents came from. So could you comment a little bit on her origins, please?
I think Fatima...
I don't think so.
Let me just use that. First of all, thank you for that lovely introduction, and to the organizers for inviting me. I think if we're going to talk about Fatima Jinnah at all, the value beyond her iconographic status is that she very well represents the transformations that were taking place in South Asia throughout the period that she lived, from the late 1800s all the way through to the 1960s. These were pivotal decades in South Asia. They represent the absolute zenith of British colonialism towards the early part of her life. It's eclipsed by the mid-20th century, and then the first and formative decades of Pakistan and India, for that matter. And during this period, you have, apart from political transformations, social transformations that completely rewrite the place of women in the world, and not merely in South Asia. And Fatima Jinnah is one of those women, I think, who didn't really write that, I wouldn't say rode that wave, but was certainly picked up by it and shaped by all of its various contours as we move through time.
So Reza, you've quoted a point of erasure, or bringing her back from a point of erasure. She herself, I think, was not a leader as such. She didn't want to be a leader as such. But nevertheless, she was very committed to many of the leadership pivotal movements that came about in the history of India. And certainly she was very enamored of her brother and very supportive of everything that he stood for. Can we talk a little bit about that point of erasure from where you've tried to bring her back?
Well, in Pakistan, I think everyone knows Fatima Jinnah from almost a sanctified perspective. She's up on a pedestal. There are universities and roads and parks named after her, but very few people have actually considered who she was. Even in terms of the academic writing on Fatima Jinnah, it's largely state-sanctioned and shaped by the ideology of the state as it evolves, and so she has been made into a variety of different people depending on who they want her to be. And looking at her own papers, going through the archives, considering her own letters, correspondence, the various speeches that she gave, the image of the person that ultimately came to me was a reluctant leader, a person who was quite happy to lead the charge, if you like, in terms of women being economically independent and therefore educated herself, ended up as a dentist, had her own practice, and I think would have been quite happy to continue in that vein. But historical circumstance didn't allow it for her, not merely because she was the brother of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, but even for Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he was a person who was shaped by a variety of unpredictable events. And the manner in which he was able to ultimately shape himself and write himself anew on various occasions is, I think, very much a trait he shared with his sister.
Reza, you've written about new Islam and about the new woman. I'd like to sort these concepts out a little bit because they interweave so closely in your book. If we can talk about new Islam, as I understand it, you've got two different strands identified in it, the clerical and non-clerical, but if you trace them far back enough, their origins are quite similar. Am I right in understanding that?
Well, Professor Francis Robinson is here at this event as well, and I think that I've learned a lot from his work and others who have particularly concentrated on changes in Islamic thought and institutions that took place in the 18th century, after which Islam itself as a set of doctrines, as a set of schools of thought and so on, was transformed in ways that set it apart from all the various movements and institutions of Islam in the pre-modern era. So it's that I refer to as New Islam. And within the context of writing that New Islam, many here might have heard of thinkers such as Shah Wali Allah of Delhi, and then at a later stage, of course, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and then on to Iqbal and Shibli Numani and so on. All of these thinkers can be seen as moving forward in a progression of thought that was responding to massive social changes that were taking place in South Asia, the very ones that shaped Jinnah and Fatima Jinnah as well. And it's in that sense that I refer to them as New Islam, almost as a convenience, that we have clerics, the ulama, who are reshaping and rethinking what Islam is. Meanwhile, we have people who are from non-clerical backgrounds like Sayyid Ahmad Khan and so on, who are also thinking, what are the new trends in Islam, what are the new trends coming from European thought, and how do they ultimately reconcile or not? Within that particular discourse, we have then the question of the role of women and how women are going to either play or not play a role in not just Islam, but in Muslim society. And that's where you get a whole host of literature that fits into this New Islam by defining a new woman for a new era. And in many respects, that new woman brings together both clerical and non-clerical schools of thought. Whereas you have Deobandi scholars and Aligarhi scholars, for example, at each other's throats about the definitions of the divine. When it comes to definitions of the role that women should play in the ideal Muslim society, they're in fact almost totally in agreement. And the agreement is that women should play a domestic role. So a woman like Fatima Jinnah very well represents how women were torn, in other words, between fulfilling this ideal on the one hand, and on the other hand, living up to their own aspirations and considering their own wants. And this created a great deal of conflict within not just the gender politics of men and women, but within the women of various societies in South Asia too.
So when the struggle for Muslim nationalism picks up, does this help women to break out of the mold that the Aligarhis and the clerics are trying to put them in, the domestic mold, or does it hinder them because they have to stick to a nationalist discourse?
So that's an excellent question, and one that's been heavily debated by scholars. There's one school of thought that would say that nationalism picked up on what women were doing for themselves and the manner in which women hoped to emancipate themselves, and ultimately drew them into a nationalist discourse that was shaped by the domestic ideal. And so, in a sense, used women to further the nationalist cause, and this is true for the Indian nationalist as much as the Pakistani, drew them into the cause, and then once the goal of independence was achieved, ultimately went back on its particular promises. In my own work, I find that that's somewhat of an easy answer to the question, because it doesn't take into account the divisions in terms of defining women and the agency of women in that definition itself. So there is also an alternative view, and people like Fatima Jinnah, Jahanara Shahnawaz, or Shaista Ikramullah represent this very well, of these women, in fact, using the nationalist movement as a means by which to forward their agendas. So the other way of looking at it basically disenfranchises and does not take into account the agency of women in choosing the discourses that they're going to participate in.
Because it's masked under the broader nationalist discourse, right? And women like Jahanara Shahnawaz, Shaista Ikramullah, they play a much more vigorous leadership role, wouldn't you say, than Fatima, who is more inclined towards relief work, social work, and very committed to that kind of work. You talk of the new woman. When does Fatima, I mean, she's a product of colonial India and of an urbane milieu that she has been exposed to because of her close relationship with her brother, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. When do you think the narrative changes and brings Fatima into prominence? I think I'd like you to talk about issues of parda maybe, because Fatima plays a key role in showing there is an alternative to women in parda.
I think this debate over parda is in fact central to the divisions when it comes to the debates between the clerical and the non-clerical Islamic reformers. While they were agreed on the definition of women as domestic, ultimately, that a woman is a wife, a woman is a mother, etc., and that even when she enters the public sphere, it's as a nurse or a teacher rather than a leader or an engineer. You know, these are male domains. But as we move forward in time, therefore, this then becomes a debate over parda as well, that even if a woman is going to be a teacher or a nurse, that kind of nurturing role that is subscribed to women, that means appearing in public. And if you're going to appear in public, then what's the right attire to be wearing? So the clerics basically argued between all but hands and face showing to complete another cover of women. Whereas on the other side, among the non-clerical reformers, you go from that kind of all but hands and face covered to traditional attire, so customary dress, dupatta, for Gujarati women like Fatima Jinnah, to modesty being defined in ways other than attire altogether. So these are debated issues. These are not issues that are ultimately resolved at the time that she lived or since. In her own way, she took a middle path. She certainly argued that the parda in this form of seclusion was entirely un-Islamic, precisely because it denied women access to the public sphere and to economic and social emancipation, which she believed that Islam actually delivered women. On the other hand, she was not in favor of the absolute westernization of the discourse either. And this had a lot to do with her political agenda. So again, there's agency here. She could certainly have been a woman who, as in her early days, wore Western dress and so on, had no dupatta, etc. But as she entered the political stage alongside her brother, I think that she weighed her options and thought in terms of the signal that sends in terms of how South Asian society, Muslim society, Pakistani nationalism is in many respects a call to authenticity. It's about showing who we are as opposed to who they are, the British. And that pillar of nationalism, therefore, brought her to a compromise ground. And if you even look at the picture on the cover, which is a very typical picture of Fatima Jinnah, what you see is a very light gauzy dupatta being her compromise in terms of public appearances.
There's an interesting episode that you've written about Jinnah and Fatima touring Balochistan, and where one of the tribal leaders' wives, she speaks up. Would you like to recount that for our audience?
So one of Muhammad Ali Jinnah's allies, political allies, and a good friend of his was a leading barrister in Balochistan, and his wife. So when in 1937, 1938, the Muslim League was touring all of the different provinces of British India to rally support for this new cause of Muslim nationalism, they were in Balochistan and were staying at this couple's house. And Muhammad Ali Jinnah, at that stage, had mooted the idea of Fatima Jinnah appearing on the stage with him, as she had in Delhi or Lahore and other parts of the subcontinent. And certain people within the party in Balochistan warned against it. They said, you're trying to rally support with the Baluchi population, and this will lose you exactly what you want. And Muhammad Ali Jinnah actually thought about it and was ready to capitulate, to say, okay, Fatima will not appear on stage with me over here. And it was Muhammad Isa, his friend's wife, who actually took him to task for this and said, basically, do you stand for what you say you stand for, or are you going to compromise depending on where you are? And apparently, Jinnah got very angry that this woman had contradicted his political wisdom and withdrew to his room. And there he thought about this a little bit more, and then came out and withdrew what he had said to her earlier and apologized. This is to the wife of his friend, and said, of course, you're absolutely right. We, as Pakistani nationalists, as Muslim nationalists, have a particular creed, and that creed includes the emancipation and full participation of women as political partners in our new nation and project. And so Fatima Jinnah, from that moment on, no matter where the Muslim League was touring, would always appear on stage. And in fact, by the 1940s, began appearing even in the absence of Jinnah. So she was no longer merely an appendage in that sense, but now representative of women more generally in the political sphere. And you mentioned Jahanara and Shaista Ikramullah and so on, Jahanara Shahnawaz. They very much saw Fatima Jinnah as their mentor. So they were political firebrands in their own right at rallies, elected to various provincial legislatures and so on. But their political agenda was shaped very much by sitting with Fatima Jinnah in her home and deciding on what they would speak on and what they wouldn't. So she decided to stay behind the scenes, at least in the colonial era, largely so that I think she felt she won't be saying anything that might embarrass her brother, and leave the other women the opportunity to play that role.
Her relationship with her brother evolves considerably, doesn't it, Reza? When he takes her away to study at a convent in Bombay and St. Peter's School in Khandala, he's more of a guardian to her, like a parent to her. And it's when they go to London, would you say, that you speak of him becoming more of a mentor? And she starts acquiring the wisdom of the world in a way. She comes out of her shell. And subsequently, there are many things people have said about her, like after partition, I think the first Indian High Commissioner called her the evil genius. Yes. That was the only one her brother heeded. Do you think there was a turning point in their relationship when she becomes stronger, maybe because of his illness?
Definitely it was in London that she, I think, it was a turning point for her because she began to open her eyes to the politics of the day. She was an observer, I think, at that stage, but her brother took her to Parliament, took her to a number of the meetings. During this time were the roundtable conferences with the Indian National Congress and so on, which she witnessed. She would be present when there were meetings with the Aga Khan, who had been the president of the Muslim League earlier. So I think the excitement of the times played a role in awakening her. And her brother, I think, welcomed having her now think in terms of the political destiny that he felt Muslims had to make for themselves moving forward. So it's soon after that when they return to British India and he embarks on the political agenda of Muslim nationalism that she now is in a position where she has seen the evolution of this movement from its beginnings. And he is getting, as you said, more and more infirmed over time. And so she's playing a more important role. There's a wonderful line that I came across, an interview with one of Muhammad Ali's many secretaries, where he says that he came to Muhammad Ali with an idea of someone had raised some issue, and Muhammad Ali said, well, I can't rule on this without it going to the committee. And the committee was Fatima Jinnah. So that gives you a good sense of the role she began to play already by the late 1930s, early 1940s. Yeah.
In fact, people have written about her representing the values of Jinnah after Jinnah died, and he died very early after the formation of Pakistan. And in a way, she doesn't aspire to leadership right away, but eventually she does come into politics. But maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. But as a new woman, you've talked about the clerical ideal, which matches the Aligarhi ideal of the domestic woman. How does Fatma fit into the ideal of the new woman. She certainly doesn't correspond to their ideal.
No, I think there are contradictions, and I think there are contradictions that are social. So in my own approach to the question of a biography like this, or history more generally, I think what needs to be considered is that history is not written, in fact, by great men and great women. The history of Pakistan is not written by Muhammad Ali Jinnah or Fatima Jinnah or Liaquat Ali Khan or any of these elite figures. They, in fact, represent trends in society that are shaping a much larger class of society. And it's in this sense that I think of Fatima Jinnah and try and speak of her in terms of the new woman. Because she is not defining the new woman. She is being, along with millions of others, being defined by this particular notion of womanhood. And as I said, it's a contested notion. There's not one way of being the new woman. There are many ways of being the new woman. And I think given her class, given her education, given her family background, particularly Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a barrister, and so on, the version of the new woman that she actually puts forward is the one that is economically and politically a participant, one that is economically in particular independent in various ways. She put great emphasis on all of this. Always stress this for women, that this is the only way that women are going to play a political or social role if they are economically independent. But at the same time, she, I think, embodied some of the more conservative aspects of the new woman as well. Particularly, again, one goes with various instances and examples. Shayista Ikramullah was a woman whose husband worked in the civil service, high-ranking. He became, a massive figure in the Pakistani civil service as well. But at the time that she was out there in the streets rallying for the Pakistan movement in the 1940s, her husband was not particularly happy about this, because he, as a civil servant, had to play a much more muted political role. In fact, he didn't even join the Muslim League until after partition, because he was a member of the civil service. So when Fatima Jinnah heard about this, she in fact advised Shayista Ikramullah to tone down her rhetoric, tone down her role, so as not to step on the toes of her husband. So you can see that there's something of a contradiction here. Fatima Jinnah herself, not a woman who never married, a woman who certainly never was held back in terms of speaking herself. But for the married woman, she was, on the other hand, advising, taking a little bit of a back seat from time to time.
It's definitely, there are hiccups there in making a consistent portrait. And I think that's one of the aspects that makes her so interesting. 1947, Pakistan is created. Jinnah and Fatima moved to Karachi. She's very active in setting up educational institutions, girls' institutes where women can work. She does a lot of relief work. And in fact, that you have written that women like her and the thousands of women who were involved in such work are probably the reason that Pakistan managed to sustain itself as a nation, right? Absolutely. 3 cheers to them. Remarkable, all of them. If only we can unearth more stories, I think we'll all be the richer for it. But when Jinnah dies, I think she tends to become quite bitter. She's very disillusioned by the Muslim League leaders, and I think she calls them feeble and polygamous. She doesn't mince her words at all. And what I'm trying to build up to is her campaign against General Ayub. But initially, when General Ayub comes, she supports him, right? So can you sort of just clear the picture for us a little bit to that point, and then we can take it to where she comes into conflict with him?
So I think she was a constitutionalist like her brother. She believed that there were no contradictions ultimately between living and creating an Islamic state, and that state being a parliamentary democracy with liberal welfare values. So what she saw after the death of her brother and in the era in which the Constitution was being written, which of course took 9 years to promulgate, was political infighting, backdoor politics, which were alienating the Bengal, East Pakistan, which were undermining the ability of those like herself and other women who were active in relief work. One of the biggest crises that Pakistan faced was housing the millions of refugees, providing education, providing jobs, providing basically a roadmap for the future. And the political infighting that was taking place during those first 9 years, therefore, left her in absolute dismay. The very people that she felt had kowtowed to Muhammad Ali's leadership, or I should say, she came to see them as kowtowers rather than people who actually believed in the cause, were now in power, were drifting towards provincialized politics, were drifting towards sectarian politics, and as far as she was concerned, this was all for personal political gain. This was not a reflection of any true ideological motivation on any of their parts. So when General Ayub basically came to power, kicking all of them out, abrogating or at least sidelining the constitution in doing so, she was very, very happy, as were, by the way, Jahanara Shahnawaz and Shaista Ikramullah and all of the major leaders of the women's movement in Pakistan, with the exception of Rana Liaquat Ali. They were all very, very pleased. But the assumption that they made was to take General Ayub's word that the constitution would be reinstituted shortly afterwards and general elections would be held, which of course did not happen until 1964. So that was basically a 6-year period in which Fatima Jinnah's own frustrations only grew to the point where she, of course, was ready to stand up herself. And I mean, she was a 70-year-old woman by then. I think she knew full well that her days were numbered. She was not doing very well. But she felt that if she, at this point, did not enter the political fray, it would be an opportunity lost for men and women who truly had believed in the same vision for Pakistan that Muhammad Ali Jinnah did, to actually assert themselves in politics.
Jamaat Islami is one of the parties in the combined opposition parties, and it was their stance never to allow a woman who's not in parda to come into government. But when they asked Fatima to lead the campaign against General Ayub, they do back down on this stance, isn't it? So just by virtue of being there, she does make them go back a little bit on their conservatism.
Actually, it was their stated policy that women, even in Parda, should not be in leadership positions in politics at all. So they really did make a huge U-turn as a member of the combined opposition parties. And Maulana Maududi himself issued a fatwa at that time. But it's a very interesting fatwa because it's entirely conditional. And it basically states that if I may just go back a bit, if we go even back to the 13th century, there's a political scientist named Ziauddin Barani who worked in the Delhi Sultanate. And he said that in Islam, in times of hunger, it's halal to eat carrion. And this is basically what Maududi pulled out to justify Fatima Jinnah's leadership. That this was a time of major crisis, and therefore an exception had to be made to allow a woman to assume a leadership role. Yes, time to eat carrion. But of course, there were plenty of other thinkers, including clerics from various schools of thought, who issued plenty of fatwas saying that within the history of Islam, there are various examples of women as in leadership positions. The only one that we don't see a woman in is the role of the Khalif. But in terms of sultanate, which would be heads of government, yes, we have many examples of women. So there's absolutely no exceptional circumstance in Fatima Jinnah playing that role.
And Reza, when she loses her, the speech that she makes to concede her loss, it's actually quite a stateswomanly speech, isn't it? Where she talks of constitutions and rights. So can you recall a little bit of her speech? Because I think it's important.
Well, again, her concession speech is basically the twilight of her political career. After conceding, we really don't see Fatima Jinnah in the public limelight at all. She withdraws to Mahatma Palace and from Flagstaff House, exactly. She spends time with friends and family. I was just, in fact, telling a friend of ours while we were at Mahatma Palace this afternoon that she would sit on the roof and listen to the Qawwali from Shah Abdullah Ghazi's mazar just down the road. And she spent her life retired and gardening. She loved gardening. So her concession speech was really her last major political statement. And she used it to reiterate, again, the political agenda that she believed had guided the creation of Pakistan. And that was an Islamic welfare state. And she reiterated exactly that point, arguing that there is no Pakistan without its people ultimately being represented through the various organs of state.
We'll take some questions in a minute. And 8th July 1967, she's a few days before her 74th birthday, and she locks herself up in her room after the night before she goes to a wedding with friends. She comes back, locks herself in her room, and when she's found the next day, she's dead. My friends have asked me to ask you about the controversy surrounding her death. And you've indicated through some sources you've quoted that it's not very clear. So,
yeah, so I mean, we all love our conspiracy theories, and the conspiracy theory is that Fatima Jinnah was murdered that very night, and that she had a lot more to offer. But when we actually look at the evidence, when we look at what documents there were, what the police commissioner said at the time, what various friends who were first on the scene, bashing down her door and finding her body, those who were there for her ghusl and other ceremonies in preparation for her burial, there's no way that we could definitively say that Fatima Jinnah was murdered, nor could we definitively say that she wasn't. So ultimately, if we were a court of law, we would say that we don't have the evidence to convict anybody.
So the controversy remains alive, right? And before I open the floor to questions, can I just ask you to comment on your methodology How difficult was it to research Fatima Jinnah's life?
So it was very difficult. Fatima Jinnah's papers, when she died in 1967, were obviously taken by the state with the intention of preserving and making them available to the public through the National Archive. And basically by 1987, they had been, the 20 years it took simply to make those papers available. But since 1987, there's been a lot of work written using those papers, but it's only, for the most part, been state-sanctioned. And therefore, free access to those papers, I would say, has not been exactly available. Even, yes, as you say, even her book, My Brother, which was a partial biography of her brother, even the parts that were available in manuscript form were not entirely published. Even they were censored, and Professor Mujahid, who was the editor of the volume, has documented this himself, that the government made it clear that there were certain portions related to Liaquat Ali Khan, Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan, that could not be published. So this tells you that actually accessing these papers was exceedingly difficult. It took me many years and a number of, I don't know how to put it even, a number of initiatives that led ultimately to my having access to the documents. Yes.
Unconventional initiatives.
Unconventional.
Right. So I think the profound irony is that a woman who is mother of the nation, and indeed you title your book Fatima Jinnah, Mother of the Nation, ends up being treated as quite a subversive character. And I think that has a lot to say about how politics develops in our country and in Pakistan, and how some of our major political figures are treated. So any questions? We can, do we have a mic? Do we have a mic? Okay, can you, oh yeah, we have a mic.
There we go.
Reza, that is excellent. Both of you went into such depth. Can you hear me, everybody? The thing is that you're talking about Fatima Jinnah giving this new woman and the Pakistani, but pre-partition and early years of partition, all these women that you mentioned, including our mothers and our family members, they worked very hard for the party and they were in politics, but in parda, in burqas. And as soon as partition came about, their burqas went away and they were out in the open and they were working very hard openly. And now there's a kind of regression setting in. How do you account for that?
The regression.
Yes.
I would say that one of the most important lessons that I've learned, whether studying Islamic thought and institutions or colonial history or the history of the Pakistan movement, is that when we think in terms of the history of Islamic thought in particular, whether in the modern period or in the past, we can never make it into a particular dogma or consider it in terms of a codified attitude towards anything. Instead, what we find is lively debate and a variety of schools of thought, writing and practicing a number of different disciplines throughout the history of Islam. And when we therefore think in terms of attitudes towards parda 70 years ago, attitudes towards parda today, what we're in fact seeing is this shifting landscape of Islamic thought and different schools of thought and different disciplines being brought to the fore and falling out of favor at different times in history. So I would say that the best way to think of it is not in terms of that was more Islamic and what's happening today is not, or vice versa, but rather to think of it in terms of which schools of Islamic thought are today politically of value to those in power.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Any other questions? Do we have any other questions? Any? Yeah? Yes? Can we have the mic here?
Well, thank you for that, both of you. I have a question. Is there anything in your book about how she felt about the Ayub Khan days?
Sorry, how she felt about what?
In the 60s,
yes,
during the Ayub Khan days, how did she feel about what happened? Is there anything, did you discover anything? Her opinion on the man himself and what happened to her?
Yes, she had definitely her opinion of Ayub Khan shifted over time. Until 58, 59, she actually held him in very high regard. She considered him one of the most honorable persons within the military establishment. She certainly preferred him to Iskandar Mirza, who she thought was a self-serving person. She absolutely loathed Begum Iskandar Mirza, who she considered one of the Karachi Begums that you should avoid at all costs. But Ayub Khan, she over time came to despise as a person who had sold out. He had sold himself out, basically. That he had come to power with the trust of the nation, including her own trust, to deliver Pakistan back to constitutional democracy, and instead spent his time in power trying to extend the military and his own tenure in office. The 1962 Constitution she was bitterly disappointed by, because it set up the system of basic democrats and so on that she felt, in fact, does not divest power, but creates a system in which the entire intelligentsia and civil society is disenfranchised from power. So it's these kinds of actions on Ayub's part that incrementally led her to feel that this man has to go. And she was willing to put her own efforts, where her mouth was in this regard.
I just want to say that she wanted to be buried next to her brother, and General Ayub said that would spoil the symmetry. So I think...
Yes. I think you very aptly told us the last days of 1967, and you said that she conceded the defeat, accepting Ayub Khan that he had won the elections, and she settled down to normal, with friends and families and attending marriages and looking after the flowers. So she was no more a threat to Ayub Khan. So there should be, I think, no conspiracy theories saying that she was murdered, because there was nothing to fear from. This is my view.
And in fact, in his own diaries and in his own autobiography, that's precisely what he says. Why would I do that? I had no reason to. Yeah,
that's a fair
absolutely.
Point. Yeah, fair point. Can we have up, and then Mehreen, and then up, right? 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you for this excellent talk. What was Ms. Fatma Jinnah's opinion on Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and the 1965 war and the Kashmir issue in particular? I know that's 3 things, but they seem relevant questions.
So she actually is one of the founders of the Kashmir Relief Organization in 1947, and worked tirelessly for the next 20 years until her death, raising funds and sending those funds and whatever other relief efforts to Kashmir, including in 1965 as well. So she definitely felt that Kashmir is a unclosed chapter in Pakistani history, that the dispute was one that needed to be resolved and should rightfully have been resolved in favor of Pakistan, and particularly in terms of the self-determination of the Kashmiri population, which she felt was strongly pro-Pakistani. So I think there's nothing more to say in terms of where her politics lay in terms of Kashmir and on that front. With Bengal, she tended to underestimate. She also, favored Urdu as the national language, was not particularly taken by the idea that we should have two national languages and so on. But even as early as 1956, she had, there are catalogs of her lecturing on the fact that West Pakistan has actually not given East Pakistan a fair shake. And the language issue was something she was very much, she used as a marker of exactly that lack of a fair shake. She also is on record of commenting on West Pakistani bigotry towards Bengalis on the basis of skin color. She chastised a guest in her own house and called her a West Pakistani bigot for saying something negative about the complexion of Bengalis. She truly felt that the East-West Pakistan model could work, that it was a matter of coming to constitutional compromise. And so I think, as far as she was concerned, Bengal responded very positively in 1965. The major popular support for her movement was, in fact, in East Pakistan, not in West Pakistan. And in Chittagong and in Dhaka and in other cities, this is where she had the largest turnout of people for her campaign. Huge, millions of people. It took her days to get from Dhaka to Chittagong because of the outpouring of people on the train tracks and so on. So I think she recognized the role that Bengal should rightfully play in a Pakistani confederation, and the Bengali population actually recognized that she was their champion in the West. And a fair person. Now, as far as the last question, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, she is said to have seen him toward the end of her life, that he visited her and talked to her about the movement for the restoration of democracy, and she basically told him, this is what we need, and passed on the baton. So I think she felt that he was a hope for the future, rightly or wrongly.
You and then you. I just want to say Lawrence Ziering, the historian, had also suggested that her leadership position paved the way for Benazir Bhutto. Just wanted to put that.
I had a quick question. You mentioned that she was an advocate for Islamic socialism or maybe an Islamic welfare state. But isn't that the narrative Imran Khan is making too, that we want a Risale Medina, and we all know the status quo and his views on women in women in politics, or his overall religious views. I just wanted to know if that was what was her thought behind saying an Islamic state. Would that give equal opportunities to men and women and religious minorities?
That's an excellent question, but Islamic socialism is a slogan, and yes, the current government uses it. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and the PPP used it. And previously, in fact, it's in Fatma Jinnah's campaign that you first see the term used very widely. And as far as her definition went, when she talked about Islamic socialism, she thought about it in Iqbalist terms, in ecumenical terms. So when Iqbal, for example, was asked, Allama Iqbal, what do you think of communism? His response was, well, that's Islam without God. And Fatima Jinnah was very heavily influenced by Iqbal's thinking. And so when she thought in terms of Islamic socialism, she thought very much in terms of a representative government that is ultimately not interested in sectarian and provincial divides, but rather in terms of an ecumenical state that is going to be inclusive, one that is going to provide franchise irrespective of class and gender.
She mirrored her brothers.
And mirrored her brother in that sense. Although I think in some respects she was more of a socialist than her brother, who was much more of a liberal.
There's a question.
Sorry.
Can you please throw some light about the relationship of Mohtamma Fatima Jinnah with the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, Liaquat Ali Khan, and his wife? According to your research, because I've read many books of different authors, and there's some kind of deterioration of relationship between three of them. On one side there's Rana Liaquat Ali and her husband, and on one side is Mohtamma Fatima Jinnah. So could you please throw some light?
In my own research, I've come to something of an intermediate position in which Liaquat Ali Khan and Muhammad Ali Jinnah had political differences from time to time, but generally were able to come back to the same page. Whereas Rana Liaquat Ali Khan and Fatima Jinnah from the 1930s, early 1930s, never saw eye to eye on anything. They fought over how you should behave in public. They argued about the correct course for Apwa. They argued about who should be in stage and who should sit where on a stage. They argued about everything. And so much of the relationship between Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Liaquat Ali Khan, and the manner in which various scholars have looked at it, has actually been colored, I think, somewhat by the fact that there was more tension between the two women than there actually was between them. Their differences were very often extremely political, but on the other hand, reconcilable because they were purely political differences. Whereas the differences between Fatima Jinnah and Rana Liaquat Ali Khan were both political and personal.
Okay, so Reza, thank you so much for coming and sharing your excellent scholarship with us. It's been a fascinating book to read.
Thank you all for the wonderful questions and for coming, and thank you, Nusrat.